Long ago, about 1800 years back, there was a kingdom that people don't really talk about anymore. You won't find it on maps, and no tour guide is going to sell you a ticket to visit its ruins. It's one of those places swallowed by time, tucked away between memory and myth. But back then, oh, it was alive. Picture it. Soft hills rolling into tall mountains, rivers sparkling like silver snakes under the sun, and villages sprinkled like beads across the valleys. The land smelled of fresh grain, wildflowers, and the smoke of warm bread rising from clay ovens. Life had a rhythm there, slow but steady, as if everyone moved to the same gentle drumbeat of the earth. The kingdom had no fancy name written down for history to keep. To its people, it was simply home, a place where seasons mattered more than calendars, and where the sky at night spilled over with stars so clear and close that even the oldest shepherds swore they could hear them whisper. At the center of it all stood the capital city. It wasn't grand like Rome, not filled with marble palaces or golden statues, but it had charm. Stone streets wound through little shops where craftsmen hammered bronze, wove wool, or carved wood into toys. Farmers brought baskets of figs, dates, and grapes to sell in the market. Children chased one another through the alleys, their laughter carrying higher than the temple bells. And high above this bustle stood the royal palace. Not a glittering castle in the fairy tale sense, but sturdy, strong, and welcoming. Built of thick stones hauled from nearby cliffs, its towers overlooked the land like guardians. Ivy crawled up its walls, and its windows glowed with torchlight at night, giving it the look of a great hearth warming the whole kingdom. Inside lived the heart of this forgotten land, its king and queen. But we'll get to them soon enough. For now, just know this. People loved their rulers as much as they loved the earth that fed them, and that was rare in those days. Still, even in a place so blessed, shadows had a way of creeping in. But before we dive into the trouble, let me slow down a little, because this story isn't just about monsters and battles. It's about people, about love that stretches further than fear, about courage that doesn't come from swinging swords alone, but from not giving up when everything seems lost. And since this is a bedtime story, I'll keep the blood and guts to a minimum. Don't worry, you'll sleep fine after this. Probably. Anyway, let's go back to that kingdom. The land stretched from thick forests in the north to wide deserts in the south. In spring, the valleys filled with wildflowers, painting the ground with purples, yellows, and blues so bright that travelers thought the earth itself wore a festival robe. In autumn, the orchards bent heavy with fruit, and the harvest festivals filled every street with song and roasted meat. The people were simple but not dull. They believed in old gods, spirits in the rivers, guardians in the trees, and whispers carried by the wind. And while outsiders might laugh at their superstitions, the kingdom thrived because its people respected both the seen and unseen. Trade flowed in from distant lands, spices that burned the tongue, silks that glimmered like water, and stories carried by merchants who'd seen worlds beyond the horizon. Yet for all its connections, the kingdom never lost its own flavor. Its songs were its own, its dances had steps no foreigner could copy, and its tales were told around fire pits long after the stars came out. The palace itself stood as the crown jewel of the capital. Its gates were carved with symbols of protection, lions and suns meant to ward off evil. Inside, long halls echoed with music and feasts. Soldiers trained in the courtyards, their spears flashing in neat lines, while scholars filled scrolls with knowledge that, sadly, most of us will never read because time wasn't very kind with storage. But even the strongest stone cannot keep out whispers of fear forever. The kingdom had known peace for many years. No major wars, no invading armies, just the occasional raid, the sort of trouble that kept the soldiers sharp but never shook the land's foundation. Yet, As anyone who's ever had a perfect week knows, calm can't last forever. Trouble always finds its way in, like that one fly buzzing into your room the moment you lie down to sleep. And in this story, trouble did not walk in politely. It crawled out of the shadows. Before the shadow came, though, the kingdom was at its height. The people celebrated their rulers with parades of flowers. Children carried tiny lanterns shaped like suns, and the queen herself would step out to greet them with a smile that made the crowd cheer. The king, tall and broad-shouldered, always had one hand resting on his sword and the other ready to wave. He had that look of a man who could be both warrior and father to his people. But what really set this kingdom apart wasn't its walls, its markets, or even its ruler's strength. It was the bond between its king and queen. Their love wasn't whispered about in secret corners. It was shouted in songs, painted on walls, and celebrated in every festival. People swore that when they stood together, no harm could ever reach the land. Of course, fate heard that boast and thought, we'll see about that. For now, though, in this first chapter, let's freeze the image in your mind. A peaceful kingdom, full of laughter and life, ruled by two figures who seemed almost untouchable. Their story, the one we're about to walk through together, would be told again and again, passed down as both legend and warning. But back then, nobody knew what was coming. Nobody guessed that from the dark edges of the forest, something old and hungry was stirring. Something that had been waiting a long, long time. And soon, the kingdom that seemed so safe, so full of joy, would tremble in fear. Yet, it would also witness something stronger than fear. Something that still echoes, 1,800 years later, whenever the tale of the forgotten kingdom is told. If a kingdom is like a body, then its rulers are the heart. And in this forgotten land, that heart beats strong, steady, and full of warmth. The king and queen were not distant figures tucked away behind high walls. They walked among their people, laughed with them, listened to them, and when the kingdom celebrated, they were right there in the middle of it, like parents at a family gathering who actually enjoy the party. The king's name has been lost to history. Some call him Aaron, others call him Kale, but names fade over centuries. What matters is what he was. He was a man built for both war and peace. Tall, broad-shouldered, and with eyes that seemed to always be measuring, weighing, deciding. People said he could read a room faster than a scribe could read a scroll. His soldiers followed him not just because he commanded them, but because they trusted him with their lives. And trust is heavier than armor. But he wasn't just a warrior king. He had a side most rulers never showed. He'd sit with farmers to hear about their crops. He'd test the blacksmith's swords with his own hand. He'd crouch down in the market to admire a child's clay toy as if it were a masterpiece. And if someone dared to cheat the poor, oh, that was a quick way to see his temper. He had a reputation, fair as summer rain, but fierce as winter storms when wrong was done.
Now the queen, she was the soul of the land. Her beauty was often praised, yes, but beauty alone doesn't hold a kingdom together. It was her kindness that carved her into the hearts of her people. She listened more than she spoke, which is rarer than jewels and rulers. She remembered names, even of servants and children. She was the type who would stop a whole parade if she saw an old woman struggling to carry water, just so she could help. And no one dared laugh at her for it, because when she smiled, the whole city seemed to smile with her. Together, they were something else entirely. Not perfect, of course. They probably argued sometimes. He likely left his boots in the wrong place, and she probably rolled her eyes when he told the same story for the 10th time at dinner. But what made them powerful wasn't being flawless. It was that they stood side by side, always. When the king rode out to inspect the borders, the queen stood at the gates to wave him off. When the queen organized a festival for the children of the city, the king was there helping set up lanterns. They were like two halves of the same coin, different yet impossible to separate. People looked at them and believed in something bigger, that love could be as strong as steel. And oh, did the people celebrate them? Every year on the day of their wedding anniversary, the city filled with flowers. Not ordered by law, not forced, but willingly. Farmers brought garlands of wheat. Merchants hung bright fabrics across their stalls. Even the poorest family would find some wildflowers to lay at the palace gates. Children sang songs written about the queen's laughter. Soldiers polished their armor until it shone like mirrors, just to march proudly before their rulers. The king and queen weren't just loved, they were trusted. And trust is rare. Think about it. How often do people really trust rulers with their lives, their hopes, their children's futures? In this kingdom, they did. Because the pair didn't sit on their thrones like statues, they lived among their people. Now, if you're picturing them as untouchable saints, let me balance the story a little. The king had his flaws. He was stubborn as a mule when he believed he was right, which probably drove the council of elders insane. And the queen? Well, she had a playful streak. She was known to slip out of the palace in plain clothes, wandering the market to test how much her people would recognize her. Spoiler, they always did. Her laugh gave her away. But she didn't mind. In fact, she enjoyed being caught. But those quirks only made them more beloved. They weren't carved idols, they were flesh and blood, and that made their greatness even more impressive. Now here's the thing about love and peace. They make you feel safe. And when you feel safe for too long, you start to believe nothing bad can touch you. The people of the kingdom felt this way. As long as the king and queen stood side by side, nothing, no army, no famine, no curse could break them. But life, as you know, has a way of testing even the strongest bonds. Still, let's not rush into the shadows just yet. For now, picture them together on a summer evening. The king in his simple tunic, not his armor, walking the palace gardens with the queen by his side. The torches flicker, the air smells of roses, and music drifts in from the city below. He listens as she tells him about the new school she wants built for the children. She listens as he worries about the strange tracks soldiers found near the forest edge. And between their words, there's laughter. Gentle, easy laughter that makes you think they truly believed peace would last forever. But of course, legends don't survive because everything stayed perfect. The story of this king and queen wasn't remembered just because they ruled kindly or loved deeply. It was remembered because their bond was tested in the harshest way. Because when the shadows rose and the monster stepped into their world, the king did not cower. He did not send soldiers in his place. He did not hide behind walls. He went after the queen himself. But that's later. That's the storm. For now, this is still the calm. The kingdom's bright, the people are happy, and the king and queen walk hand in hand, unaware of the darkness creeping closer. And maybe, just maybe, that's why their story still lives after 1,800 years. Because people love a tale where love is tested but does not break. Every kingdom has its secrets. Some are small, like the baker who adds just a little too much sugar to his bread but won't admit it. Others are darker, like whispers of places where people don't go after sunset. For this kingdom, that shadowy place was the northern forest. The forest was massive, stretching across the land like a green sea. During the day, it looked harmless enough. Trees rose high, leaves shivered in the breeze, and sunlight spilled through the branches like golden coins. Deer moved quietly, birds sang, and from far away it looked peaceful, almost friendly. But ask anyone in the kingdom, and they'd tell you the same thing. Don't go too deep, not when the sun's going down. The forest had a reputation. Strange sounds echoed there at night. Travelers claimed they saw glowing eyes in the dark, too high to belong to wolves. Hunters swore they'd followed deer tracks, only to find them suddenly vanish, as if the earth itself had swallowed the animal whole. Even the bravest soldiers didn't camp inside the forest unless they had to, and when they did, they kept the fires burning big and bright, as if light itself could scare away whatever lived in the shadows. Most people treated it like an old superstition, a story told to keep children from wandering too far while picking berries. Parents would wag their finger and say, "Stay near the edge, or the forest will take you." The kids would laugh, of course, but none of them actually tested the warning. Kids are daring, sure, but they're not stupid. Still, for years, nothing truly terrible happened. The forest just stayed there, silent, brooding, waiting. The kingdom grew, the people thrived, and the scary stories turned into the kind of campfire tales that make you shiver while secretly enjoying it. But then, little by little, things began to change. It started small. A few farmers near the edge reported missing goats. That wasn't new. Wolves and thieves had always been around, but the tracks left behind didn't look like wolves. They were bigger, much bigger. Then hunters stopped returning. Not entire groups, but one or two at a time. At first, people thought they'd just gotten lost, but when seasoned hunters, men who knew the forest better than their own homes, vanished without a trace, the whispers grew louder.
The queen, though, felt uneasy. She trusted the instincts of her people, and she noticed how quickly fear spread. She told the king, "Shadows grow when we pretend not to see them." But he reassured her, promised her he would keep watch. He even laughed one evening and said, "If a monster dares come near this city, I'll make sure it regrets being born." Bold words, the kind that sounds strong at dinner, but weigh heavy in the middle of the night. Meanwhile, the forest grew stranger. Travelers avoided the northern road, preferring to take longer routes around it. Merchants who once passed through began to whisper about curses. Priests started offering extra prayers to the gods, asking for protection from things they didn't name aloud. And then came the night that changed everything. The moon was full, hanging like a silver shield in the sky. The city was calm, most people asleep, the streets quiet. But from the forest came a sound so loud, so terrible, that it echoed across the hills. It wasn't a wolf's howl or a lion's roar. It was both and more. Deep, rumbling, endless. A sound that felt like it came not from an animal's throat, but from the earth itself. People woke up in terror. Dogs barked wildly, chickens flapped out of their coops, and even the bravest soldiers admitted later that the sound made their bones shake. For hours, nothing followed, just silence. But everyone knew it was the kind of silence that hides teeth. The next morning, a group of woodcutters failed to return. The day after, their tools were found near the forest's edge, splintered, broken, scattered like toys after a storm. No bodies, no tracks, just the faint smell of something foul, something rotten, lingering in the air. That's when the kingdom realized the stories weren't just stories. Something lived in that forest, and it was moving closer. The people looked to the king. He gave speeches of courage, promised safety, told his soldiers to guard the borders more closely. But fear doesn't bow to speeches. Fear spreads like fire. And soon, everyone, from the palace servants to the merchants in the market, began whispering the same thing. The monster has woken. Of course, no one had seen it clearly yet, just glimpses. A shadow moving between trees, eyes gleaming red in the dark, claw marks higher than any man's head. But isn't that how monsters are strongest? Not in the shape, but in the not knowing, in the way they slip between fact and nightmare, until you're not sure what's real anymore.
And the worst part? The forest, once something to avoid, now felt alive. People swore the trees leaned closer, that the shadows stretched farther, as if the whole place breathed with the monster's hunger. The king, for all his strength, knew something had to be done. But how do you fight what you can't see? How do you stand against a shadow that slips through trees, strikes without warning, and leaves nothing behind? The queen watched the worry deepen in his eyes, though he tried to hide it. She told him gently, "Whatever it is, we'll face it together." He smiled at her then, grateful but tired, as if some part of him knew that the forest wasn't done, not even close. And so the kingdom waited. Guards at the walls, priests at their temples, children clinging to their mothers, and everyone listening for the next roar. Because the monster was real, and the monster was hungry. For a while, the monster was just a rumor in the trees, a sound in the night, a shadow moving too quickly, a claw mark too deep to explain. That was scary enough, but what came next stripped away all doubt. The first real sighting happened on a stormy evening. The clouds were thick and heavy, rolling over the sky like black waves. Rain poured down, turning the streets into streams and the fields into mud pits. Farmers had pulled their animals into barns. Soldiers had pulled cloaks tight around their shoulders, and most of the city had gone to bed early, hoping to sleep through the weather. But near the northern forest, a patrol of soldiers didn't get that luxury. They had been sent to watch the border. 6 men, armed with spears and torches, walking the muddy road while trying not to slip. The storm was bad, but not unusual. What was unusual was the silence. No owls, no wolves, not even frogs. Just rain hammering down. And then, under the rain, came a sound none of them could mistake. Heavy steps. Not horse steps, not human steps. Something bigger. The men froze. The torches flickered in the wind, rain hissing as it fell on the flames. Then they saw it. At first it was just a shape, a massive, hulking shadow pushing between the trees, branches snapping like twigs under its weight. The soldiers lifted their spears, though some of their hands shook so badly the metal rattled. And then lightning spit the sky, and for one long, terrible second, the monster stood revealed. It was enormous. Taller than 2 men stacked together, with a body twisted like something half-born of the earth and half-born of nightmares. Its skin looked rough, like stone or scales, and patches of dark fur bristled across its shoulders. Its arms were long, ending in claws that gleamed sharper than any sword. And its eyes glowed deep red, like coals pulled from a fire. The storm swallowed the light again, leaving the men in darkness, but the image burned into their minds. One man dropped his spear and ran. Another whispered a prayer. The captain tried to steady them, shouting, "Hold your ground!" But when the monster let out a roar, a sound so powerful it shook the rain itself, holding ground was impossible. The patrols scattered. Some ran back towards the city, others dove into the mud, but by morning only 2 returned. Soaked, trembling, and pale, they stumbled into the palace to deliver the news. The monster wasn't just a shadow. It was real, and it was worse than anyone imagined. The king listened in silence. His face didn't show fear, but his fists were clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. The queen sat beside him, her hand resting gently on his, steadying him. The council of elders argued, some calling for the army to march into the forest, others demanding the city gates be sealed. But the king said little. He simply nodded and dismissed the soldiers to rest, though their screams in the night told the whole palace they hadn't really left the forest behind. From that day on, the monster stopped hiding. People began to see it more often. Farmers glimpsed it from the fields, moving at the tree line. Shepherds swore they saw it on the hills, silhouetted against the moonlight. Caravans passing the northern road found wagons smashed, wheels splintered, and horses gone. The monster didn't kill for food alone. It destroyed. It tore through fences, shattered doors, ripped apart storage barns. Whole herds of animals vanished, and when people whispered that it had taken a man or two, no one argued. No one wanted to. It became clear this wasn't a simple beast. Wolves kill to eat. Bears fight when threatened. But this thing hunted for hunger and for hate. It seemed to enjoy leaving fear in its wake. Some priests said it wasn't an animal at all, but a curse, punishment sent from gods long forgotten. Others said it was older than the kingdom itself, something that had slept under the forest roots until now. The queen asked the king one night, "Why now? Why wake after all these years?" He didn't answer right away. Finally he said, "I don't know, but I intend to find out." The people grew restless. They wanted answers, but all they got was fear. Markets closed early, festivals stopped, children no longer played near the gates, and every time night fell, everyone prayed it wouldn't be the night the monster came closer. And then, as if fear itself wasn't enough, came the tale of the mason.
He had been repairing part of the wall near the forest side, a strong man, used to climbing scaffolds and hauling stones. But one morning his tools were found scattered across the ground. The stone he'd been lifting cracked in half. His fellow workers swore they heard him scream the night before, but by the time they ran to look, he was gone. All they found were claw marks across the wall itself, so deep it looked like butter sliced by a knife. That claw mark became a warning. People went to see it, whispering, pointing, shaking their heads. And though the king had it covered with plaster, the memory stuck. You can cover stone, but not fear. The monster was no longer just a story. It was here. It was real. And while the king's soldiers trained harder, while priests prayed louder, while merchants begged to close the northern gates, the queen held on to one thought. Something this terrible wasn't finished. The monster had showed itself, yes, but it hadn't yet shown what it truly wanted. And when it did, the kingdom would tremble like never before. The monster had been circling the kingdom for weeks, maybe months. Each night the people prayed it would stay in the forest. Each morning they sighed with relief when the walls still stood and the sun still rose. But deep down, everyone knew it was only a matter of time before the shadows struck at the heart of the land. That day came without warning. It began like any other. The city was busy, children chasing each other through the markets, merchants shouting about their figs and dates, blacksmiths hammering away so loudly it felt like the whole place had a headache. The queen spent her morning in the courtyard, meeting with teachers about a new school she wanted to open. She had that calm smile she always carried, the kind that made even the busiest workers stop and bow. The king had ridden out with a small troop to inspect the southern borders. Bandits had been spotted there, and he wanted to make sure they didn't think the kingdom was distracted by northern troubles. He left in the morning, promising the queen he would return before nightfall. She teased him, saying, "Don't come back covered in dust again. Last time you scared the palace maids half to death." He laughed, kissed her hand, and rode off. It was a simple day, normal, peaceful, until the sun began to sink. As twilight spread across the city, the guards on the northern walls saw movement. At first, they thought it was the wind in the trees. Then, they heard the growl. Deep, low, rolling across the ground like thunder crawling on its belly. Torches shook in their hands. The monster had come. The warning bell rang out, sharp and frantic. People rushed into their homes, doors slammed shut, shutters clattered closed. Soldiers grabbed weapons and ran to the gates, but the monster wasn't interested in the gates.
Not that night. It went straight for the palace. No one knew how it got past the outer walls. Some swore it leapt clean over them, a shadow so fast no one could stop it. Others said the ground itself cracked open and it rose from beneath. However it happened, within moments, the palace shook with screams. The queen had been walking the garden path, lanterns glowing softly around her, when the sound hit. A roar so loud the glass lanterns shattered, flames snuffed out in an instant. Guards rushed forward, swords flashing, but the garden turned into chaos. The monster stepped out from the shadows, taller than the trees, claws catching the moonlight, eyes burning red. The guards charged, but they were swatted aside like flies. Armor cracked, spears broke, and the queen stood frozen, her heart pounding but refusing to run. She lifted her chin, her eyes steady, though inside her fear screamed. The monster lowered its head. For a moment, it almost looked like it was studying her, choosing. And then, with a speed no one expected, it struck. Claws wrapped around her like iron bars. She cried out as the ground vanished beneath her feet. The remaining guards shouted, slashed at its arms, but nothing cut deep enough. One brave soldier tried to stab its eye. He didn't live long enough to try again. The queen struggled, but the monster carried her, as if she weighed no more than a scarf. With a roar that rattled the palace windows, it leapt, clearing the garden wall in a single bound. And then it was gone, vanishing into the forest, the queen's scream echoing behind it. By the time the king returned, the city was chaos. The bells still rang, the people wept in the streets, and soldiers knelt in shame. He rode hard through the gates, demanding answers, his horse foaming with sweat. When the captain of the guard told him what had happened, the king's face went pale. For the first time in his life, he felt powerless. His queen, his partner, his soul, was gone, taken by the very shadow that had haunted his people. The palace was heavy with grief that night. Servants wept in corners, the elders gathered in silence, their prayers trembling. The city outside stayed awake, every window glowing with candlelight, as if no one dared let darkness fully fall. But the king did not sit in despair. He stormed into the throne room, slammed his sword on the stone floor, and swore before everyone, "I will bring her back. No forest, no shadow, no monster will keep my queen from me. I will walk into its lair myself if I must, but she will return." The oath spread through the city faster than the fear. People whispered it to each other, clung to it like a rope in a storm. Their king had spoken, and though they feared the monster, they believed in him. Still, as strong as the words sounded, the king knew the truth in his heart. This was no simple hunt. This was not a raid or a battle with men. He was facing something older, darker, something that seemed to enjoy tearing hope from people's chests. That night, as he stood at the balcony, staring at the black line of forest against the horizon, he let his guard drop for just a moment. His chest ached, his hands shook. He whispered into the night as if she could hear him, "Hold on, I'm coming for you." And far away, deep within the twisting forest, the queen sat trapped in darkness, the monster's hot breath at her back, her heart pounding. But even then, she refused to break. She whispered back into the dark, steady and sure, "He will come." The palace felt like it had lost its heartbeat. No music echoed in the halls, no servants whispered cheerfully as they polished floors or carried trays. Instead, there was only the soft sound of muffled sobs, clinking armor, and the heavy silence of a kingdom afraid to breathe. The queen was gone, and everyone knew it. The king sat in the great hall that night, still dressed in his riding cloak. Dust streaked his boots, his gloves were stiff with sweat, but he hadn't bothered to change. He hadn't even touched the food that servants laid before him. Bread grew stale on golden plates, wine warmed in its cup, but the king didn't care. His eyes were locked on the floor, his jaw clenched so tight that the muscles ached.
He kept replaying it in his mind, the moment the guard told him what happened. He had arrived too late, only to find blood on the garden path, broken weapons, and no queen. That was the part that gutted him most. She had been alone. He wasn't there when she needed him most. A king is supposed to protect his people, but what good was he if he couldn't even protect the woman he loved?
At first, despair was all he felt. A heavy, drowning kind of sorrow that made his chest tight and his head hang low. He had ruled through battles, famines, and droughts, but this pain was worse than all of them. He didn't cry often, not in front of others at least, but that night, when the hall was empty and the torches burned low, he let the tears fall. He whispered her name, and it echoed back at him through the stone like a cruel reminder of how alone he was. But despair didn't last forever. The king wasn't built to stay broken. Slowly, grief turned into fire, and that fire burned hotter with each thought of the monster carrying her away. He stood suddenly, his chair scraping across the marble floor so loudly it startled the guards at the door. His fist slammed the table, rattling the untouched plates. "Enough," he growled. "Enough of sorrow, enough of fear. If the monster thinks it can take my queen, it has no idea who it is dealing with." The guards straightened. Servants peeked from the corners, eyes wide. The king's voice had changed. It was no longer weighed down by despair. It was sharp, fierce, alive. He called for the council. The elders shuffled in with their scrolls. The generals came in, clinking armor, and priests carried candles that flickered in the draft. They looked at their king and saw a man on the edge of fury and resolve. "Tell me everything," he commanded. "Every tale, every rumor, every old story about this beast. Where it came from, what it wants, how it can be destroyed. Do not leave out a single detail." The council murmured nervously. Some admitted they had nothing but old legends, half-remembered tales passed down by grandmothers. Others whispered that the monster was cursed by the gods, that no man could kill it. One even suggested the unthinkable. Perhaps the queen was lost forever. The king slammed his sword on the stone floor, the ringing sound echoing like thunder through the chamber. "Say that again," he warned, eyes blazing. The elder who spoke quickly fell silent, trembling. The king's voice softened then, but it carried weight. "As long as my heart beats, she is not lost. I will not sit idle. I will not wait. I will bring her back, even if I must walk into the monster's lair with only this sword in my hand." The hall was silent. Then, slowly, one by one, the men and women of the court knelt, not because he was king, but because they felt the power of his vow. The fire in his voice lit something inside them, too. That night, word spread through the city like a gust of wind through dry grass. The king had sworn an oath. He would not rest, he would not retreat until the queen was returned. Mothers repeated it to calm their frightened children. Soldiers whispered it as they sharpened their blades. Even merchants muttered it over their empty stalls, holding on to that spark of hope. Still, when the night grew quiet and the torches burned low, the king returned to his chambers, alone again. He stood at the window, staring out into the dark forest beyond the city walls. The trees swayed like black waves, and somewhere far within them he imagined her, his queen, waiting, enduring, hoping. He clenched the window ledge until his knuckles went white. "Hold on," he whispered. "I am coming." It wasn't just a promise anymore. It was the very fuel that kept him breathing. Before he lay down that night, he went to the small chapel within the palace. No one followed him. He didn't ask them to. There, in the flickering glow of candles, he knelt before the altar. His sword lay across his knees, his head bowed low. Gods, ancestors,
whatever power listens tonight, grant me strength, not for glory, not for my crown, but for her. Give me the strength to walk into darkness and bring her home." His words lingered in the air, heavy and raw. He didn't know if the gods heard him, but his heart felt lighter after speaking them. When he rose again, there was no doubt left in his mind. Tomorrow, he would begin preparing. Tomorrow, he would seek out knowledge, weapons, and allies. Tomorrow, the hunt would begin. But tonight, in the silence of the chapel, the king finally allowed himself a small, tired smile, because even in the shadows, he could almost hear her voice, steady and unbroken, whispering back, "I believe in you." Morning came slowly, with gray clouds covering the sun, as if even the sky mourned with the kingdom. The city stirred to life, though it felt different now. Markets were quieter, children played closer to home, and guards patrolled with heavier steps. Everyone knew the queen was gone, and everyone wondered, what would the king do next? Inside the palace, the king had already begun moving. He hadn't slept much. His eyes were sharp, though, filled with the fire of his vow. He summoned the elders, men and women whose wisdom was older than his crown, whose knowledge stretched back through generations. They gathered in the council chamber, a long stone hall with tapestries showing battles of old. At the center stood a heavy oak table, polished smooth by centuries of elbows and arguments. Around it sat the kingdom's wisest, gray-haired historians, wrinkled priests, scarred warriors who had survived when others didn't. Some leaned on staffs, others clutched scrolls, and all wore the look of people who had seen much, but not this. The king entered, his footsteps echoing across the chamber. The elders rose, bowed, and waited. He didn't waste time. "You all know why I've called you," he said, voice steady. "The queen has been taken. The monster that haunts our land has struck at the heart of the kingdom. I swore an oath last night to bring her back, but to do so, I need your counsel. Tell me everything, every legend, every whisper, every scrap of wisdom about this beast, where it came from, what it wants, how it can be destroyed. Do not leave out a single detail." The elders murmured nervously. Some admitted they had nothing but old legends, half-remembered tales passed down by grandmothers. Others whispered that the monster was cursed by the gods, that no man could kill it. One even suggested the unthinkable. Perhaps the queen was lost forever.
The king's jaw clenched. He could already feel the weight of the journey pressing against him, the danger pulling at his resolve. But his oath burned stronger. "Then illusions won't stop me," he said. "And if the sword exists, I will find it. Tell me, where do I begin?" The elders unrolled maps that crackled with age. Fingers traced faded ink lines showing forests, mountains, rivers that no one alive had ever crossed. Stories spilled into the air, of a cave where stars touched the ground, of guardians carved from stone that moved when angered, of trials said to test the heart as much as the blade. The king listened, storing every detail. He asked questions, direct, sharp, almost impatient. But beneath his determination, the elders could see the truth. This wasn't just a king preparing for a campaign. This was a husband desperate to save his wife. At one point, the bearded elder coughed, clearing his throat. "Forgive me, sire, but you are not young anymore. This quest will demand more than strength. It will demand endurance, cunning, and faith. Perhaps," he hesitated, "perhaps it is better to gather an army, not ride out alone." The king gave a small smile, dry but firm. "An army cannot sneak past illusions. An army cannot outwit ancient curses. This task is mine, mine alone. If the gods demand courage, they will have it."
The council fell silent. They knew better than to argue further. The king had made his mind. But before they dismissed, the youngest elder, barely gray at the temples, spoke softly. Then take this warning, my lord. Every monster feeds on something. Fear, greed, despair. These are its weapons as much as claws and teeth. Guard your heart as fiercely as you wield your sword. For if you lose yourself, no weapon will matter. The words settled like a shadow across the table. The king nodded slowly, respecting the wisdom. The meeting ended, but the weight of it stayed with him. As he left the hall, the elders bowed low, not just to his crown, but to his resolve. He had chosen his path. That night, as the city slept uneasily, the king prepared. He had maps copied, supplies gathered, and armor polished until it gleamed. Servants begged him to rest, but he only shook his head. "I'll rest when she is home." Before dawn, he stood on the palace balcony again, staring at the dark line of the forest, and whispered the same words he had whispered every night since she was taken. "Hold on. I'm coming." And somewhere, far beyond the trees, in the cold silence of the monster's lair, the queen sat in the dark. Her body ached, her spirit trembled, but when she closed her eyes, she could almost hear his vow echoing across the distance, and it gave her strength. The king thought he had gathered all the wisdom the elders could give him. Maps, half-remembered songs, strange warnings about illusions and curses. That was enough to start a quest, or so he believed. But sometimes the past refuses to stay buried, and sometimes the old stories have a way of finding you when you least expect them. It began the next morning. The palace was buzzing as preparations for the king's journey moved quickly. Smiths worked through the night to sharpen blades. Horses were groomed, packs filled with dried meat, bread, and flasks of water. The air smelled of leather and iron, and servants whispered nervously as they carried gear. The king oversaw it all with steady eyes, though inside he knew this was no ordinary march. This was a step into the unknown. Just as he was checking the straps of his saddle, a voice called out from behind him, "My lord." He turned. An old priest, one who hadn't spoken during the council, shuffled forward. His robe was frayed, his beard white as snow. His eyes, though, were sharp, almost glowing. He remembered him faintly. Brother Caldus, keeper of the oldest scrolls in the temple. Quiet, often overlooked, but never unwise. "My king," Caldus said, bowing deeply, "before you go, there is something you must hear. Something we did not speak of in council, for fear it would sound like madness." The king raised a brow. "Madness or not, speak it. I have no time for secrets." The old priest nodded. His hands shook as he unrolled a brittle parchment, edges dark with age. Strange symbols lined the edges, but in the middle was written, in faded ink, words that made the king's blood run cold. "When darkness rises from the earth, when the queen of light is stolen, a king must walk into shadow alone. He shall not triumph by strength, nor by steel forged of men, but by fire that fell from the heavens. Only then shall the beast be broken." The hall went still. Even the bustling servants paused, listening. The king stared at the words, his jaw tight. He said, "So the old tales of the Starfire blade are more than legend." Caldus nodded slowly. "Yes, my lord. But the prophecy does not end there." He hesitated, his wrinkled fingers turning the parchment. "There is another part, one that few like to read aloud." "Read it," the king commanded. The priest's voice shook as he continued. "But beware, O king of men, for the beast is not your only trial. You must face the shadows within, or lose yourself before the blade is won. Should despair consume your heart, the queen shall fade, the kingdom fall, and night shall reign eternal." The words seemed to echo in the air.
heavier than stone. The king felt them pressing against his chest. Shadows within, despair. The prophecy was not only about fighting the monster, it was about fighting himself. For a moment, he stood in silence, eyes locked on the parchment. Finally, he let out a dry laugh. So the gods wished to test my patience as well as my sword arm. Wonderful. A few nervous chuckles rippled through the hall, though they quickly faded. Calda stepped closer, lowering his voice. My lord, this prophecy is both warning and guide. You will not succeed by brute force alone. Courage will carry you far, but it may not be enough. You must guard your heart as fiercely as you wield your sword. The king nodded slowly. I hear you, old friend, and I will remember. But know this, whatever shadows lie ahead, I will not let them take me. The queen is my light. As long as she lives, no darkness will win. The priest's eyes softened. For the first time, he smiled. Then perhaps the prophecy chose wisely. The king rolled up the parchment himself, tucking it into his pack. He wasn't sure if it would guide him or haunt him, but one thing was certain. It mattered, and he would carry it with him. Later that day, as he prepared to leave, he found himself thinking about the words again. The part about facing the shadows within. What did that mean? Fear? Anger? Doubt? He had all of those, no matter how steady he tried to appear, but he couldn't let them win. Not now. That evening, before he rode out, he gathered the people of the city in the main square. Thousands came, crowding the streets and rooftops, lanterns glowing like stars. They wanted to see him one last time, to hear his voice before he vanished into the forest. He stood before them, sword strapped across his back, cloak rippling in the night air. His voice rang clear. My people, darkness has struck at us, stealing our queen, stealing our peace. But hear me now. I will not stop. I will not falter until she is returned. I go not as a king alone, but as a husband, as a man who will not surrender to fear.
The beast may have claws, but we have courage, and courage burns brighter than any shadow. The crowd roared with hope, tears and cheers mixing in the night. For a brief moment, the city breathed again. Yet, as the cheering faded and the torches dimmed, the king's thoughts returned to the prophecy. He whispered it to himself like a warning. Face the shadows within. Far away, in the depths of the forest, the queen sat in her dark prison. She did not know of the prophecy, but she felt something shift, as if a great weight had been set upon the king. She closed her eyes and whispered, Do not give up. Not you. And the night carried her words, soft but steady, as though the forest itself bent to listen. The king's journey began at dawn. The gates of the city opened with a groan, and he rode out beneath the sky still brushed with stars. Behind him, the walls loomed tall and heavy, filled with the faces of people watching silently. Some waved, some prayed, and some simply stood in awe. He didn't look back. Looking back made journeys harder. The road stretched wide at first, well paved, familiar. But the farther he went, the more it narrowed, the stones turning to dirt, the dirt to tangled roots. The air grew heavier too, carrying the distant scent of pine and something else, something faintly rotten. The forest was near. Before reaching the thick trees, the king came upon a small village. Its houses leaned tiredly, as if ready to collapse with one strong wind. Smoke curled from only a few chimneys, and the streets were empty. Not the lively kind of empty, but the fearful kind, curtains drawn, shutters closed, doors bolted. He slowed his horse and called out, I mean no harm. I seek shelter, nothing more. At first, No answer came. Then, slowly, a door creaked open. A woman in a worn cloak stepped out, holding a bundle of herbs. Her face was lined with age and exhaustion, but her eyes were sharp. "You're heading toward the forest, aren't you?" she asked, her voice rough. The king nodded. "I am." She sighed, shaking her head. "Then either you're braver than most, or more foolish." He gave a small smile. "Perhaps both. But I go to face the monster that haunts this land. It has taken my queen." At that, the woman's eyes softened. She gestured for him to follow. "Come then, stranger. You should hear what we know." The king dismounted and followed her into a small hut that smelled of smoke, dried herbs, and old wood. Inside, a few others gathered, men and women, some with bandaged limbs, others with haunted eyes. They looked up when he entered, and the room fell into a heavy silence. The woman set her herbs aside and spoke. "We are healers, my lord, or what's left of them. We tend to those the monster has touched, but not taken. Few survive its claws, but some do, and those who survive," she glanced at the others, "are never quite whole again." One man lifted his sleeve to show scars running deep across his arm, jagged and twisted. Another woman sat in the corner, rocking slowly, whispering words that made no sense. The king's heart tightened. These were not soldiers or fighters, just ordinary people who had brushed too close to the monster's shadow. "Does it always leave its mark like this?" he asked quietly. The healer nodded. "Yes, not just on the body, but on the mind. Some lose the will to live. Others see the beast in every shadow, hear its growl in every silence. We patch their wounds, but we cannot heal what lingers inside." The king frowned, his hand tightening on his sword hilt. "Then tell me, what have you learned? Anything? Weaknesses? Habits?" The woman shook her head slowly. "It comes when it pleases. It leaves ruin behind. We have seen arrows bounce off its hide, blades snap against its skin. Fire frightens it, but only for a moment. And always it takes something: food, cattle, or people." The room grew quiet again. The hopelessness was thick, like a fog that clung to the walls. The king felt it pressing in on him. He understood why they were weary, why they seemed broken, but he could not allow that same fog to smother him. He straightened, his voice firm. "Listen to me," he said. "I do not deny the monster's strength, but I will not let fear rule us. My queen is still alive, and I will bring her back. I cannot promise victory, but I can promise this: I will not stop until the beast is defeated. Not for me, not only for her, but for all of you, so no one else suffers these scars." The hopeless faces shifted. Some looked skeptical, some looked surprised, and one or two dared to show a flicker of hope. The woman studied him for a long moment, then gave a small nod. "Then take this," she said, reaching into a basket and pulling out a pouch of herbs. "Burn them when you are weary. Their smoke drives away nightmares, for a time at least, and you will need clear dreams for the path ahead." The king accepted it with a grateful bow. "Your gift will not be wasted." That night, he stayed in the village. He shared bread with the wounded, listened to their broken stories, and offered words of courage where he could. He wasn't a healer, but sometimes healing wasn't about herbs or bandages. Sometimes it was about reminding people that light still existed. As the fire crackled, one scarred soldier limped up to him. "My king,
the man said softly. "I thought all was lost, but when you speak, it feels like the world isn't ending. For that, thank you." The king clasped his arm firmly. "Then hold on to that feeling, because I'll need you, and all of us, to believe it's true." Later, when the village slept, the king sat awake by the fire. He unrolled the prophecy parchment again, reading the words by flickering flame. "You must face the shadows within." He thought of the hopeless eyes he'd seen tonight, the despair that had nearly swallowed them. Was that what the prophecy meant? That despair itself was as dangerous as the monster? He clenched the parchment and whispered to the flames, "I will not let despair win. Not here, not in me, not ever." In the distance, deep within the forest, the monster stirred. It lifted its head as if it had heard him, and its glowing eyes narrowed. And in the darkness of its lair, the queen whispered to herself again, steady and sure, "He is coming. I know it." The forest was waiting for him. The king left the village at dawn, after thanking the healers for their kindness. His horse's hooves carried him down the dirt road until the last chimney smoke faded behind him. Ahead, the trees stood tall and thick, their branches knit so tightly together it looked like a wall of living shadow. It wasn't the kind of forest people visited for berries or wood. No children wandered here, no hunters bragged of its game. Everyone knew better. The closer the king rode, the quieter the world became. Birds stopped singing. Even the wind seemed to hesitate, whispering only in short, nervous sighs. When he reached the first line of trees, his horse snorted, ears pinned back. The animal stamped its hooves as if to say, "Are you sure about this?" The king patted his neck. "I don't like it either," he admitted, "but we don't get to choose." He nudged the horse forward, and together they stepped into the shadow of the forest. Immediately, the air changed. It was cooler, thicker, carrying the smell of damp earth and moss. Sunlight barely pierced the canopy, slipping through in thin golden lines. The path beneath was narrow, winding, and overgrown, as though no one had used it in years. The king kept one hand on his reins, the other resting on his sword hilt.
Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves made his shoulders tense. He had fought men, armies even, but this was different. Men bled, men broke. Here, the enemy was unseen, everywhere at once. Hours passed. He rode carefully, eyes sharp, ears tuned to the smallest sound. Once he thought he heard footsteps behind him, but when he turned, there was nothing. Another time he swore he saw a figure dart between trees, a flicker of white cloth like a woman's dress. His heart leapt, thinking of the queen, but when he called out, the forest only answered with silence. The words of the prophecy gnawed at him. Illusions, the elders had warned him. The monster would twist what he saw, what he heard, maybe even what he felt. By midday, the king stopped to rest. He tied his horse near a stream and knelt to drink. The water was cold, almost too cold, and for a moment he thought he saw his reflection staring back at him, but smiling, cruel and sharp. He blinked, and the image was gone, just his tired face remained. "Shadows within. I see what you mean." He pressed on. The deeper he went, the stranger the forest became. Trees grew taller, their roots curling like claws. Strange markings appeared on rocks, carved long ago, their meanings lost to time. Sometimes he heard whispers, soft as breath, speaking words he couldn't understand. By evening, he reached a small clearing. He decided to make camp there.
lighting a fire that crackled against the creeping dark. He chewed on dried bread, though it tasted like ash in his mouth. Sleep tugged at him, but he hesitated. Night in the forest felt dangerous, as if the shadows would creep closer the moment his eyes shut. Still, exhaustion won. He lay down beside the fire, sword close at hand. His dreams came quickly, and they were not kind. He dreamt of the queen, chained in darkness, calling his name. He ran to her, heart pounding, but every step pushed her farther away. Then the forest twisted, and suddenly it wasn't her voice he heard, but the monster's growl, deep and mocking. He woke with a start, sweat dripping down his face, his sword already in his hand. The fire was nearly out. Beyond the faint glow, he swore he saw eyes watching him, red, glowing, unblinking. He raised his blade, steadying his breath, only for the eyes to blink out like candles snuffed in the dark. The king fed the fire with trembling hands, whispering to himself, "Just shadows, just tricks." Morning came slow, gray and heavy. He packed up quickly, eager to keep moving. The forest only grew denser, the path more uncertain. Sometimes it forked into 2 or 3 trails, but none were marked. He chose by instinct, trusting the pull in his chest that told him, this way. At one point, he heard laughter. Not cruel, but light, familiar, the queen's laugh. He froze, spinning in place. The sound came from the left, weaving through the trees. His heart pounded. Every part of him wanted to run toward it, but his mind whispered the truth. Illusion. He clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay still. Not today, he growled into the empty air. The laughter faded, replaced by the groan of the trees. He pressed on, each step heavier than the last. By afternoon, he stumbled upon ruins, stone walls half buried by moss, pillars broken and leaning. They looked ancient, built by hands long gone. In the center lay a cracked statue of a warrior, sword raised high. The sight filled him with both awe and unease. As he approached, a crow cawed loudly from above, startling him. His hand flew to his sword before he realized it was just a bird. He chuckled softly. I'm jumping at feathers now. Wonderful. But then he noticed something carved into the base of the statue. Words, faint but still legible. The path is not walked by the strong, but by the steadfast. The king traced the letters with his fingers. It felt like another piece of the puzzle, another whisper of the prophecy reminding him this wasn't about brute strength alone. He set up camp among the ruins that night, the broken stone making him feel strangely less alone. He burned the herbs the healer had given him, and their smoke curled gently into the night, sweet and calming. His dreams were quieter, though still shadowed. As he drifted toward sleep, he whispered, "Hold on, my queen, I'm closer every step." Far away, in the monster's lair, the queen stirred as if she had heard him. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to close her eyes and rest. And in the dark trees around the king's camp, something moved, watching silently. The forest was not done with him yet.
But you do not command me. The shadow snarled, striking again. But this time, the king didn't meet force with force. He shifted, dodged, stepped aside. He let the blow pass harmlessly. And in that instant, the figure staggered. Its form rippled like water disturbed. The king didn't need to overpower it. He needed to outlast it. Each time the shadow struck, he deflected instead of clashing. Each taunt he met with silence. Each laugh he ignored. Slowly, the figure faltered, its edges breaking apart, its voice losing strength.
Finally, with one last desperate swing, it dissolved back into the pool, the water rippling before going still again. The reflection returned, just his face now, tired, worn, but his own. The forest was quiet once more. The king knelt by the pool, breathing hard, his hands trembling. He touched the water, and for the first time in days, he allowed himself a small smile. "Steadfast," he whispered. He didn't feel stronger, not in the way of muscles or weapons, but inside, something steadied. The trial hadn't been about defeating an enemy. It had been about mastering himself. He stood, sheathing his sword, and glanced back the way he'd come. Part of him wanted to return to his horse, to the ruins, to the safety of familiar ground. But the other part, the stronger part, knew there was no turning back. The forest shifted as he walked on. The air grew heavier still, the trees taller, their roots twisting like serpents. The shadows clung to him, but now he carried a spark of calm. The monster could play tricks, yes, but he knew who he was. By the time he stopped for the night, the fire he lit felt warmer, steadier. He ate what little food he had left and sat against a fallen log, staring into the flames. His mind replayed the fight, the shadow's words echoing in the dark corners of his thoughts. But instead of fear, he felt a kind of strange relief. Because if the monster was trying to break him, then it was afraid of him too. He chuckled softly to himself, shaking his head. Afraid of a tired man who talks to fires. Imagine that. The fire crackled back as if in agreement. And though the forest around him stayed watchful, the king slept a little easier that night. The king woke early, the fire reduced to glowing embers. Mist curled low across the forest floor, soft and ghostly, blurring the edges of the trees. He rose slowly, stretching his stiff limbs. His sword felt heavier than usual, though maybe that was just the memory of the fight with his shadow. He pressed forward. The path wound deeper, darker. Branches hung low like arms reaching for him. The air smelt faintly sweet, like overripe fruit, and carried a strange hum, as though the forest itself whispered beneath his steps. Hours passed in silence, until suddenly he heard music. It came faintly at first, a gentle sound, almost like a harp or a flute, the kind of music played at royal feasts, soft enough to make people sway without realizing it. His chest tightened. It reminded him of the palace, of the queen laughing at the musicians when they struck a wrong note. He froze. The elder's warning returned to him, trials of illusion. But the music was so real, so warm. It pulled at him, tugging at his heart like a thread. Against his better judgment, he followed. The trees parted to reveal another clearing, and in the center, sitting on a fallen log, was the queen. She was dressed in the gown she had worn on the day of their wedding, white silk flowing like moonlight, her hair crowned with small golden leaves. She held a harp, fingers plucking strings in a tune so familiar that it made his eyes sting. "Beloved," she said, her voice soft as morning, "you came." The king's heart slammed against his ribs. Every part of him wanted to run to her, to fall into her arms, to believe it was real. His boots even shifted forward before he caught himself. He forced his eyes to narrow. "You are not her." The figure tilted her head, smiling sadly. "Is that how you greet me, after all I've endured?" Her words pierced him. They sounded so much like her. And when she set the harp aside and stood, her steps were light, graceful, exactly as he remembered. She held out her hands.
Come to me, free me." He took another step, then stopped. The elder's words echoed again. "Shadows will whisper sweet lies, taking the shape of what you most desire." He drew a shaky breath. "If you are her, then tell me, what did you say to me on the day I rode to the southern border, the morning before the monster came?" The figure smiled, confident. "I told you to return quickly. I told you I loved you." The king's jaw tightened. Close, but not the truth. He lifted his sword. "No, you told me not to come back covered in dust again, because I'd scare the maids. That was her. You," he pointed the blade, "are nothing but a trick." The figure's smile cracked. Then, before his eyes, the queen's form melted away like wax in fire. The white gown blackened, the golden crown twisted into thorns. Where she had stood now towered a tall creature of smoke and shadow, its face featureless except for two burning eyes. The harp in its hands snapped in half, the sound like bones breaking. The king braced himself, expecting an attack, but instead the creature only hissed. "You resist well, but how long before hope breaks you?" And with that, it dissolved into the mist, leaving the clearing empty. The king's chest heaved, his heart aching as though he had truly seen her. He wanted to collapse, to let the grief pull him under, but he steadied himself, forcing the weight into his breath. He whispered into the silence, "Wait for me, my queen. I know you're still out there." He sat at the edge of the clearing, drinking water from his flask, trying to slow the storm inside his chest. His hands trembled. The trial hadn't been about strength, not even skill. It had been about love, about whether he could tell truth from illusion, even when every part of him longed to believe the lie. When he rose again, he felt heavier, but he also felt clearer. The forest pressed closer now, as if displeased. The shadows seemed darker, the path less certain. At times he thought he heard the monster's growl in the distance, low and taunting, but when he turned, nothing was there. By evening, he stumbled upon a stone archway half buried in vines. It looked like the entrance to something, perhaps an ancient road, or maybe just another trick of the forest. Still, it felt significant. He camped there, resting beneath the arch's broken stones. As he lit his fire, he spoke aloud, as though the queen could hear him. "They can show me your face, your voice, even your laugh, but they cannot take your soul, and that is what I fight for." The flames flickered brighter, almost in agreement. The king smiled faintly, leaning back against the stone. His eyelids grew heavy, but this time his dreams were quieter. The queen's face appeared again, but she was silent, smiling softly, and he knew it was only memory. The second trial was done, but in the depths of the forest the monster stirred. Its illusions had failed, and it was not pleased. By the third day in the forest, the king's legs felt like stone. His food was nearly gone, his water skin lighter by the hour. The deeper he went, the less the world looked like the forest he had entered. The trees here were darker, older, their trunks wide enough to swallow houses. The air smelt faintly smoke and iron, and every breath felt thick, like it carried ash.
He knew he was nearing the monster's domain. But before he could reach it, he felt the forest shift. The ground trembled softly, as though something massive moved beneath it. The branches above creaked, and a low hum filled the air, so deep it rattled his chest. The king tightened his grip on his sword. "Another trial," he whispered. "Let's finish this." The path opened into a vast hollow, where the trees bent inward, their roots curling up from the ground like twisted claws. At the center stood a stone circle, ancient and broken, the kind of place that felt sacred or cursed. As he stepped inside, the air thickened. His breath came shallow, and then he heard them. Voices. Not the monster's growl this time, nor illusions of the queen's laugh. These were deeper, familiar, painfully familiar. "Why didn't you save us?" The king froze. The voice was his father's. "You promised," another voice said. His mother. Shadows rippled along the edges of the circle. Faces emerged, pale and twisted. Soldiers he had led into battle years ago, their armor broken, their eyes empty. Farmers who had died during a famine, their hands thin as sticks. Even children, faces he remembered only from funeral pyres. All of them stared at him. "You let us fall. You called yourself protector. You failed us." The king's knees weakened. His sword slipped from his hand and clattered on the stone floor. He wanted to shout back, to say he had done his best, that he had fought, bled, sacrificed. But the weight of their gazes pressed down until his chest felt like it might crack. He sank to his knees. The shadows circled closer, their voices overlapping, whispering, accusing. "Unfit king, broken man, you will fail her too." Tears stung his eyes. Was it true? Was he only chasing a hope that would crumble, just as so many hopes had before? His hands shook, pressing against the stone floor. And then he heard another voice. Not an accusation, not anger, a memory. The queen's voice, soft and steady. "You are not measured by the lives you cannot save, but by the love you give to those you can." He remembered it now. Words she had told him long ago after a battle that had left too many dead. Words that had kept him standing then and could keep him standing now. He closed his eyes, breathing deep. The shadows pressed tighter, their whisper sharp, but he whispered back steadily, "I am not perfect. I have lost. I have failed. But I do not stop. That is what makes me king. That is what makes me hers." The shadows shrieked, their forms twisting like smoke in a storm. The faces melted, voices breaking apart into hollow wails. The circle shook, stones cracking, roots splitting, until finally the vision shattered. The hollow fell silent. The king opened his eyes. He was alone. His sword lay beside him. He picked it up, his hand steadier now. The third trial had not tested his strength, nor even his love. It had tested his guilt, his ability to stand beneath the crushing weight of memory and still move forward. And he had. The air around him felt lighter, though the forest remained dark. The trials were done. The monster's illusions had failed. But as he left the stone circle, he could not help but glance back. The silence of the place lingered like a warning. He whispered under his breath, "Rest well, all of you. I carry you with me." That night, he camped beneath a tree so tall it seemed to pierce the clouds. His fire burned small but bright. He ate the last of his bread, drank the last of his water, and sat quietly, his thoughts calm for the first time in days. He had faced his own shadow. He had faced false love. He had faced guilt. And now, nothing remained but the final task, to face the monster itself. As the fire crackled low, he lifted his eyes to the stars barely visible through the canopy. He said softly, "Tomorrow, I come for you, my queen." And somewhere in the forest, far ahead, the monster stirred. It knew the king was near, and for the first time, perhaps, it felt a sliver of unease. The forest narrowed as though guiding him, its trees crowding close, their trunks like blackened pillars. The air grew thick with smoke, though no fire burned nearby. The king pressed forward, every step heavier, every breath dragging like stone. He had survived the trials,
but he knew what wait ahead would not be illusion. By midday, the path ended at a cliff. Below stretched a wide gorge, its depths hidden by swirling mist. The ground shook faintly, and from somewhere far below came the echo of a growl, so deep it felt like the earth's own voice. The king stood at the edge, gripping his sword, scanning for a way across. And then he saw it. A bridge, or what once had been a bridge. Ancient ropes, frayed and sagging, held together by planks as thin as kindling. It swayed gently over the chasm, creaking as though sighing under its own age. He muttered, "Of course it's a rope bridge. Why wouldn't it be?" Still he stepped forward. The first plank groaned, but held. The second bent under his weight, but did not break. Hand over hand, step by step, he crossed, the mist curling around him like cold fingers. At the halfway point, he glanced down, only for the mist to part, revealing jagged rocks far below. His stomach lurched. "Don't look down," he told himself, eyes snapping back to the far side. At last, his boots touched solid ground again. He exhaled, shaking the tension from his shoulders. Ahead, the forest ended. The trees gave way to a great black mouth of stone, a cavern so vast it swallowed the light. From within came the steady rumble of breath, slow and monstrous. The lair. The king stepped closer. The ground here was scorched, the earth cracked. Bones littered the entrance, animal, human, impossible to tell. Each one whitened with age, a reminder of those who had come before and never returned. He knelt for a moment, resting his hand on the hilt of his sword. "You brought me this far," he whispered to himself. "Don't let me fail now." The cavern swallowed him whole. Inside, the air was damp, reeking of smoke and rot. The walls glistened with moisture, and somewhere in the distance, water dripped in slow, steady beats. But beneath it all was another sound, the Queen's voice. Faint, but real. "Help, help me." The king's heart tightened. He followed the sound, deeper and deeper, the glow of his torch flickering against jagged stone. Shadows stretched and curled along the walls, some twisting into shapes that looked almost alive. At last, he entered a vast chamber. The ceiling soared out of sight, stalactites hanging like teeth. In the center lay the monster. It was larger than he had imagined. Its body sprawled across the stone like a mountain of muscle and scale. Its claws scraped grooves into the ground even as it slept. Its chest rose and fell with each thunderous breath, the sound vibrating through the chamber. Its face, half hidden in shadow, bare eyes closed, but glowing faintly, as though fire lived behind its lids. And chained to a rock near its side was the Queen. Her gown was torn, her face pale, but her eyes widened when she saw him. "Beloved," she whispered, her voice breaking. The king's heart tightened with relief and fury at all once. He wanted to rush to her, to cut the chains, to carry her away, but he forced himself to stay still. The monster's breathing shifted, one eye cracked open, glowing red. The cavern shook with its growl.
Slowly, it rose. Each movement was deliberate, echoing through the chamber like thunder. Its wings unfurled, scraping stone, its tail lashing with a sound like whips. Its gaze locked on him, ancient, merciless, alive with hunger. The Queen cried out, straining against her chains, "No, run!" The king did not move. His sword gleamed in the torchlight as he drew it free. His voice was steady, though his heart pounded like a drum. "I came for her, and I will not leave without her." The monster roared, a sound so loud it felt like the cavern itself might collapse. Dust rained from the ceiling, the ground split beneath his feet, and the fire in its eyes blazed brighter. The king planted his boots firmly on the stone. His trials were over. His journey through shadow and silence had led here, to this moment. No more illusions, no more whispers, no more tricks. Only the battle remained. And as the monster stepped forward, its claws gouging deep into the earth, the king raised his sword high. The final fight had begun. The roar still echoed in the king's ears long after the sound had faded. Dust drifted from the ceiling, the walls trembling as though even the cave itself feared what was about to unfold. The monster stood fully now, towering above him, wings spread wide. Its scales shimmered in the torchlight like black iron, and its claws glistened sharp enough to slice stone. The king tightened his grip on his sword. His throat was dry, but his eyes stayed locked on the creature. He had faced storms, illusions, trials of mind and body, but nothing compared to this, standing before a beast that had swallowed men whole, that had haunted villages for generations. The queen tugged at her chains, her voice breaking. "Don't fight it! You'll die!" The king turned his head just slightly, enough to meet her eyes. "I'd rather die fighting for you than live without trying." The monster lunged. It moved faster than its size promised. Its claws slammed into the stone where the king had stood a heartbeat earlier, shattering the ground. The king rolled aside, the impact rattling through his bones. He scrambled to his feet and swung his blade, striking along the beast's forearm. Sparks flew. The sword cut, but shallow. Its scales were thicker than armor. The monster shrieked, the sound piercing, almost blinding. Then came fire. From its throat erupted a torrent of flame, white-hot and furious. The king dropped low behind a boulder, the heat searing his skin even through the stone. The rock hissed, glowing faintly, and he knew it would not hold long. He darted out, circling, forcing the beast to turn. Each step echoed in the vast chamber, his torch extinguished now, leaving only the glow of fire from the creature's breath and eyes. Shadows danced wildly, making the cavern feel alive. The king swung again, this time aiming for the softer spot beneath the monster's jaw. The blade struck true, piercing a shallow wound. Dark blood, thick and steaming, spilled onto the stone. The monster reeled back, shaking its head, slamming its tail into the ground. The shockwave knocked the king off his feet. He hit hard, his sword clattering away into the dark. The queen screamed his name. The monster loomed above him, chest glowing faintly as it drew in air for another blast. The king scrambled, hands scraping stone, searching desperately for his weapon. His fingers brushed the hilt just as the creature unleashed another inferno. He rolled, sword in hand, barely escaping the fire. The edges of his cloak caught flame, and he beat it out with his free hand, coughing in the smoke. His lungs burned, his arms ached, but he rose again. He couldn't win with strength alone. He needed a plan. His eyes darted around the chamber. Stalactites hung above like spears. The chains that bound the queen were anchored to a pillar near the monster's flank. If he could wound it enough, if he could force it closer. He shouted, banging his sword against the rock to draw its focus. The sound rang through the cavern. The beast turned, its red eyes narrowing. "Come on, then!" the king roared. "Face me!" The monster charged. The king sprinted toward the chained pillar, forcing the creature to follow. At the last moment, he veered aside, leaping behind the stone. The monster's momentum carried it forward. Its claw slammed into the pillar, cracking it. The queen gasped as the chains rattled. The king emerged from behind, swinging upward with all his strength. His blade sank deep this time, slicing into the soft tissue of the beast's wing. The monster screamed, staggering, its movements uneven now. It turned on him, enraged, tail whipping. The strike caught him across the chest. The impact threw him across the chamber. He hit the ground hard, vision flashing white, ribs aching. He coughed blood, but forced himself up. His sword was still in his hand. He had no time to falter.
The queen cried out again, tears streaking her face. "Please, don't give up!" Her voice fueled him. The monster reared back, lifting its massive body, preparing to crush him under its weight. The king steadied himself, breath ragged, every muscle screaming, and then he ran forward, not away, toward it. At the last instant he dove beneath its body, rolling between its legs. His sword struck upward, slicing through the softer scales along its belly. The wound tore open, and a river of dark blood spilled onto the stone. The monster howled in agony, staggering, crashing into the cavern wall, rocks tumbling, dust choking the air. The king scrambled to his feet, raising his sword high. Above, the stalactites shook loose from the ceiling, cracked by the beast's thrashing. He saw his chance. With a final cry, he drove his blade into the wall beside him, splitting the rock that held the largest stalactite. It broke free, plummeting down like a spear from the heavens. The monster lifted its head just in time to see it fall. The impact shook the chamber, stone shattered. The stalactite drove through its chest, pinning it to the earth. The beast roared once more, a sound of rage and pain and finality, and then fell silent. Its glowing eyes dimmed. Its chest rose no more. The cavern echoed with stillness. The king stood trembling, his sword slick with blood, his body battered and burned. For a long moment he simply stared, chest heaving, waiting to see if the creature would rise again. It did not. Slowly, he turned to the queen. She sobbed with relief, chains rattling as she reached toward him. He staggered to her side, lifting his sword once more, this time to shatter the locks that bound her. The chains fell, clattering to the stone. She collapsed into his arms, clinging to him as though she would never let go. "You came for me," she whispered. "Always," he breathed, holding her close. The monster's body lay still behind them, a mountain of shadow and silence. The cavern smelled of smoke and iron, of blood and dust, but for the first time in years, it was free of fear. Together, leaning on each other for strength, they walked out of the cavern. The night air met them like a blessing. Stars shone above, cool wind brushing against their faces. Behind them, the lair was quiet, the monster forever defeated. The king had kept his promise. He had saved his queen.